Hello, everybody. Welcome to Derek's Live Chat Show. Today, I'm delighted to have Phil Jesson with me. Phil has just written this book, From Survive to Thrive. And he's written this book during lockdown, and all the proceeds go to the NHS, the National Health Service, which is absolutely fantastic. I bought 5, and the 5 arrived in a nice envelope, and I wondered what the book would be like. But I was blown away with the 365 tips and techniques, and I phoned Phil up and I said, how did you do that? It's so thick, I would have had no idea how to do it. Well, I discovered, of course, that Phil trained at the British Military Academy at Sandhurst and was a soldier in the British Army, and spent some time on tours abroad, which he's going to share that with us. And then it became clear how Phil managed to structure it, because as a banker, I could never really structure anything. We had to just dig things up out in the trenches and see what we could find out. So welcome, Phil. And Phil, I'd like to ask you a few questions, and I'd like to turn to the book, because I think out some things that I'd like to quiz you about. But first of all, tell me, as a young boy, what did you learn at Sandhurst?
Well, the first thing I learnt at Sandhurst, because of the regime there, was how to cope with 15-hour days and all of the physical and mental exertion associated with that. So developing coping strategies, I think, around that sort of pressure. But I think it was a huge insight for me into what leadership and teams are all about. And some of the things that I've talked about for many a year go back to that sort of pivotal time in my sort of 2-year stint at Sandhurst. So, for example, when I work with teams talking about leadership, they often find that very, very difficult to define. But the definition that I learned many years ago is that leadership is about the ability to inspire willing action. And I think the other key element of that, if you think about our lives in the commercial world or the not-for-profit world, is that I think there's a huge difference between being a boss and being a leader. And over the years, sadly, I've worked with many clients, chief executives, who were irritating bosses rather than them being inspirational leaders. So I think the military was a very, very good grounding for me, learning about all of that stuff. And it didn't sort of stop there. I can remember when I got to my first posting, which was in Gibraltar, I can remember my boss thumbing through the confidential report from Sandhurst. And to be honest, during my 2 years there were times where I'd actually struggled with it. So I sort of finished middle of the pack, you might say. So my boss is sitting in the office in Gibraltar, day one, thumbing through my confidential report, turning the page, saying things like, oh, interesting, Phil. And then he would turn another page and say, really? And then he would turn another page and say, So it was not going too well. And just when I expected him to say, you need to get yourself sorted out because we're heading for Northern Ireland, he leaned across the table and in a very calm voice, he said, well, I've just read this report and I can see that I have got some work to do. And I loved him for that. He was a man who recognized that in order to get the best out of me, he had to change first. And yet very often, if you think about our commercial lives, it's very often the other way around. I've worked with executives that will say, well, I'll be nice to Fred once Fred sorts himself out. This was a man who had the complete reverse of that. He believed, rather like the Gandhi quote, that you have to be the change that you want to see in the world. And he was very much that way orientated. He knew that he had to change before he expected to see any change from me. So yeah, it was a huge learning environment, Derek.
Tell me about Northern Ireland, or tell me what you can about Northern Ireland, because they were terrible times and the troubles, and I know the army was put in there, and you must have been one of the first people. Phil, how old were you at that time as well?
Yeah, it was muck and bullets, to be honest. I was 20 years old at the time, with 30 soldiers in Londonderry, and Londonderry, as you may know, is famous for the Bogside, which was the scene of the Bloody Sunday business, also the home of Martin McGuinness and co. So it was a baptism of fire. But one of the things that I learned very quickly in Northern Ireland was that if you want to develop responsibility in people, you have to give them the responsibility. One will breed the other. And if you think about the very, very tight urban environment of Northern Ireland, housing estates basically, there was a view within the officer ranks that only officers and sergeants would be able to lead patrols through those very, very tight urban areas. But because of the geography that we had to cover, very often there were patrols of 3 and patrols of 6 going out, and the radios and the maps were not in the hands of the officers and the sergeants. There was a view that, you know, quote, the lads won't be able to take the pressure, unquote. What actually happened was that the lads, given that responsibility, became very responsible. And I've always remembered that. And it's really just about trust, and where possible, giving people a lot of responsibility in a low risk environment. And as they become more and more at ease with that, increasing the risk factor as you go along. And of course, what tends to happen is that people time and time again used to surprise me with the talent and the development that was going on in front of my eyes.
And were you able to promote them, the people that took those? Because it must have just been privates that joined up.
No, they became lance corporals and moved through the ranks. And one of the things that I was very proud of in my 18 months out there is that a lot of people were promoted through my hands, so to speak. And I felt really chuffed with that. I think that was one of the things looking back in time that I'm particularly proud of.
And I'm not sure you want to answer this question, so don't if you don't, but what was the scariest moment in Derry, as the Irish say, or Londonderry, as the Brits say?
It's tempting to say the violence or the bullets. That wasn't the case. I think the scariest thing was the deep hatred and loathing between two communities that could not get on. And I can remember standing in front of a window at night time, and the lights were turned on inside of the house, which meant that I was silhouetted. And of course, if you're silhouetted in front of a lit window, you move very quickly out of the way because you are basically a target. And as I then stood in the doorway, the door opened and somebody looking like my mother, the same age as my mother, looked me in the eye and said, "I hope you die tonight, you limey bastard." And I think that type of deep, deep tribal hatred was the thing that really shocked and surprised me. Interestingly, John Hume, the MP who's died recently over this last week, he's often attributed with defining what the Irish problem is really about. And one side will say it's about a united Ireland. The other side will say it's about retaining being part of the UK. And John Hume said, no, it's not. It's not about those tribal views. It is about the relationship between two different communities and how we manage the relationship between two different communities. Now it's not about going back 300 or 400 years and trying to change history and the various constitutions that went with it.
Wow. Wow, that's deep thinking for all of us, isn't it? Because those sort of troubles are going on in lots and lots of places around the world at this very, very minute.
Yeah.
Phil, can I change the subject? What motivated you to write this? And come on then, how did you do it in 3 months?
Well, the honest answer to that is I dabbled with it last year in a very half-hearted way and probably wrote about 20 pages of it. But when the lockdown kicked in, that, along with the heroic performance of our NHS and care workers, gave me that sense of purpose that fueled that journey. So one little military model that I can share with you, Derek, as you're obviously interested in that,
Very interesting.
is there's a little mnemonic in the military world called OPERA, and that stands for objective, plan, execute, review, and amend. So following that objective, plan, execute, review, and amend, it wasn't that difficult to build the sort of project plan around it. And I know you were mentioning Tim earlier, who's talked about VUCA and all of that volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity stuff that's going on in the world today. That little opera model is quite interesting because 10 years ago in business, the O and the P were the dominant letters of that mnemonic, having a very, very clear objective and a very, very clear plan. That is not the case today. And as Winston Churchill once said, no plan survives contact with the enemy. The two letters that are most important today are the R and the A. It's the review and amend, and it's the speed at which organizations can review and amend what's going on in their world and come back with an appropriate response. So it's a very interesting model in more ways than one.
And I'll be looking at that very carefully in the travel industry.
Yeah,
I think we're all interested in, aren't we? But, you know, with the level of debt they have and no income, goodness knows what will happen. Okay, turning to the book, there's some really interesting stories in there. And I love the seminar in a day and the quotes, etc. But you told me the mountain story is one of the ones that the leaders you talk to are most interested in.
Yeah, the three mountains, as I call it. And this goes back to a project I was involved with some years ago. And it sounds rather glamorous. It took place in Oslo. And it wasn't my client, but I was bolted onto this team of people that went to Oslo with the top 100 people from Marks and Spencer who were developing all sorts of problems. And this was at the time where the media were just beginning to have a serious pop at them and saying that they'd lost their way and so on. So if you picture the scene, the 100 people from Marks and Spencer were treated to a whole range of Scandinavian leaders that were talking to them about how you turn the business round. And of the dozen or so people that were there, the one I remember is the guy who ran Bang & Olufsen. And you know exactly what Bang & Olufsen are all about. Top-end hi-fi in a very nice piece of furniture. If you've got one of those, you're probably earning far too much. That's another story.
I haven't.
No, okay. I'm getting a few smiles there. There's a few people earning far too much there, Derek. So the guy from Bang & Olufsen stood up and he talking to these 100 people from Marks and Spencer, and he pointed out that when he was the newly appointed chief executive of Bang & Olufsen, he identified 3 objectives that had to be hit in order to save the business. And he drew them on a flip chart like 3 mountain peaks. And he labeled them 1, 2, and 3 and explained what they were. Then, interestingly, he drew the cloud base on the 3 mountains and shaded it in. So if you picture the flip chart, you've got 3 mountain peaks. that are clear at the top. Thank you. You got the old illustration there.
Yeah.
3 mountain peaks that are clear at the top, and then they are shaded in as the cloud base. And he said to the group, including me, my job as the chief executive is to stay on top of those mountains where the air is clean and the visibility is good. My job is not to go into the cloud base to solve other people's problems. My job is not to go into the cloud base just to find out how hard my people are working. I know they're working very hard. My job as the chief executive is about a low number of high priority issues. We have 3, we have to hit them. My job is to stay on top of the mountains where the air is clean and the visibility is good. And I've shared that story with many clients over the years, particularly those organizations that proudly tell me they've got 25 strategic objectives. And I then groan and say, oh dear. And they often say, what do you mean, oh dear? And I have to tell them that story very often in a workshop. And of course, where we are then headed, not surprisingly, is that by the end of the day, we're down to 3 objectives, 3 mountains, a low number of high priority issues, not a high number of low priority issues. And to me, that's very important, because if you think about communicating goals and objectives to the workforce, if people have to go looking for their goals, then management has failed. Brackets, in my view. People should be able to recall their top 3 objectives. They ought to be able to recall the team's top 3 objectives, and they ought to be able to recall the organization's top 3 objectives without having to look for it. So that's really where the power of those 3 mountains comes into it. So at the time that I first heard that story, I would describe myself as a co-learner in the room, but I think I've since become a disciple of that man, and all of the very simple but highly focused work that he did at Bang & Olufsen to turn it around.
Fantastic, Phil. Now, like me, you talk about the power of 3. I'm going to switch to tip 101. I haven't told you that so far, but that is about the power of 3, where you talk about it, and also you don't need to look it up. I'm a great believer in it. We see the politicians doing it all the time, but you are a particularly big believer in it, and it works, doesn't it? It works.
Yeah, the power of 3 in a communication message, you mean?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, absolutely right. And if you think about the structure that sits behind a lot of advertising slogans or politician sound bites, they revolve around 3 key points. If you think back to that good old commercial, a miles a day helps you work, rest and play. 3 words that go in almost rhythmically. And there is some research on this, as you may know, that again says that people will remember 3. They won't necessarily remember 5 or 10 or 15 or whatever, but they will remember 3. So with that in mind, I often recommend that when you're doing a presentation, you only have 3 objectives for that presentation. When you wrap the thing up at the end of the presentation, there are only 3 summarizing points. If you talk to the audience and say, well, these are the 3 things that I hope you do, the chances are they will do those 3 because they will still remember them outside the meeting room. So yes, I'm a great believer in the power of that, well researched, as I mentioned, by spin doctors and advertising agencies alike.
Would you recommend them also for a business pitch, a report as well? These are the 3 things we're going to talk about, and at the end summary, these are the 3 points, because I've seen so many times, 150 points, why we should do this.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think about a business pitch, you may well have an opening slide that says, well, these are the 3 things that I want to cover today. and there are 3 bullet points on that slide with a diagram or a cartoon or a graphic maybe of some sort. But people don't want to see a slide with 12 bullet points on at the start of a presentation. They'll be reaching for a cushion.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Now,
if you think about Will's world, for example, if you think about the networking world, you know, I'm not the first to say that when people are networking, they very often try and leave the other person with 3 things to remember about them. They don't try and leave them with 15 things to remember about them, but just 3. Absolutely. They will remember 3.
You talk about tip number 5 is getting in the canoe, which I thought was a very interesting take on don't look in the reason the rear view mirror is much smaller than the windscreen because you're going forward. You put that early in. You put that early in the book.
Yeah, and if you haven't heard the story, it's not mine originally, incidentally, but it is a very nice story of the 2 people that are on the canal. And it's all, you know, they're enjoying themselves on a nice weekend away, and they come across a canal and think, well, let's go on that for a couple of hours. And one is in the rowing boat and one is in a canoe. And they are rowing along and they are paddling along very nicely for half an hour. And then the guy in the rowing boat says, okay, just pull into the side. I'd like to have a go in that canoe. And the canoeist says, well, I can't really see your point because you're going along at the same speed as me. We're chatting as we're going along. You know, get on with it. And half an hour later, the guy in the rowing boat gets very, very insistent and says, no, into the side. I really must have that canoe. And the canoeist said, well, what exactly is your problem? Why is that so important to you? And the guy in the rowing boat says, well, I've been thinking about this for the last hour. I've been looking backwards at where I've come from. You're the one that's looking forwards where you're going. The reason why I often tell that story is that a lot of systems in organizations are rowing boats. They tell a lot about yesterday, last week, last month, last quarter. Not enough of the systems and processes are oriented towards the canoe thinking future. I have lost count of the meetings that I've gone to where the first hour and a half is about the past. And when you think about the past, there's not a lot you can do about it because it's dead. It is gone. It is history. It is a dead body. You can cut it up and try and identify why it died. But more importantly, it's about what are people doing this afternoon, tomorrow, the day after, next week, next month, next quarter. It's really about spending time on the future because we're going to spend the rest of our lives there.
Absolutely, Phil. Ladies and gentlemen, don't forget to put your questions in the chat box for Phil, which we will go through in a little while. Phil, number 10 is measure the heart count. I really like that one. That really hit me right here. Can you run that past us?
Yeah, again, I think it has its origins from my early time in the forces, where it relies, of course, on a high level of motivation, morale, and engagement. The interesting thing is that often when I work with an executive team and say to them, give me the numbers that you measure, all of the predictable numbers are then written on the flip chart by me. I hear things like turnover, profitability, market share, X% divided by Y%, product mix, market mix, ratios on this, ratios on that. Now, for me, one of the top 3 numbers, and I'm not arrogant enough to say it should be the top, but one of the top 3 numbers an organization should measure is the heart count. And what that means, it's the heart count as a percentage of the head count. When you think of a head count of 60 people, how many of the 60 have got their hearts emotionally aligned with what the organization is trying to do. If you've got a head count of 60 and a heart count of 10, that is very, very hard work. If you've got a head count of 60 and a heart count of 40 people are on board at an emotional engaged level, then that is fantastic progress. If you've got a heart count of 50, you're there, because you don't have to worry about the 10 who are not there, because they'll very soon realize that the organization they joined has moved on. And all of those things that were important to them 15 years ago are not there now. The organization has changed and developed, and maybe they're going to be happier elsewhere. So there are, of course, many, many devices that organizations use to measure heart count, everything from SurveyMonkey to these company medicals that you see organizations using, very often questions that are designed to get people to comment on their understanding of policy and how well is the communication process working, etc. One of the very good organizations to check out on this topic, as you may know, is the Gallup organization. I'm seeing a few nods there. I think they dominate the high ground in terms of the organizations in the business world that are really checked out this area of employee engagement. And if you go online and just put into Google the Gallup 12, you'll find the 12 statements that Gallup use to measure how engaged a workforce is. I see Duncan's nodding there. Have you been down that? No, you can't talk to me, Duncan. We'll come back to that later.
We'll talk to you later, Phil. Don't worry. We'll switch him on later.
Oh, you'll switch him on later. Yeah. But you might want to check out those Gallup 12, because they are very, very significant statements that are worth using in order to try and measure that heart count. So I think it goes without saying, if you look at the research, that organizations that have got a very high heart count are more profitable than those with a low heart count. And the likes of Richard Branson and others learnt that a long, long time ago, making sure that the engagement levels were high, therefore the way that they work with customers would be spectacular. Likewise, First Direct and many other examples that you could think of.
I find it extraordinary that other organisations, ones that, one I work for, Barclays, for example, who was in the press yesterday for measuring the productivity on the telephone of its staff to check up on what they were doing. I find that that sort of behaviour quite extraordinary, and people haven't learned from it.
Yeah, well, you're talking about snoopervision.
Yes, is that what it's called? I hadn't heard that, snoopervision. Phil, you say in your book that the average research that Gallup says that 32% of people would be engaged, 50% not engaged, and 18% actively disengaged. That's sort of an average across the UK. Yeah,
that's their figures. Okay. Or to put it another way, if you imagine 10 people in a boat, 2 people are rowing frantically, 6 are idling along, and a couple are trying to sink the boat.
Yeah, that's a big worry, isn't it?
The numbers are not good. The numbers are not good. But you can see there's plenty of scope there for improving those numbers. But one of the things associated with that is that if you're a believer in the 80-20 principle,
big
time, very often quoted, of course, that 80% of our business comes from 20% of our customers, or if you're an HR manager, 80% of your problems come from 20% of the workforce. But the interesting thing about the 80-20 rule is that 20% of the workforce will have a dramatic impact on the other 80%. And many managers, I think, when they're running culture change programs, they're very, very clever at getting those 20% on board because of the peer group impact that they have in that culture change program. So although the Gallup figures sound quite low, only 2 people paddling frantically, you might say, if they're the right 2 people, they can still have a huge impact on their peers as any culture change program or project goes to work.
Yeah, fantastic. I'd like to turn to number 38 now, which we talked about yesterday. Achieve 100% of your goals in 80% of the time. That's probably the 80-20 rule coming in here as well, isn't it?
It is, and that's courtesy of an old boss of mine called Derek.
Oh.
And yes, another Derek.
I don't remember that.
Yeah. And at the time, I was running an office in Nottingham with a team of about 30 or 40 people. And things were not going well, I have to say. And my boss, Derek, came up from the Wembley head office, and he was quite critical of me being completely knackered and not achieving a lot. So he looked me in the eye and he said, Phil, you should be achieving 100% of your goals in 80% of the time. And on that 1 day a week that you've got spare, I want you to go on any training course you want. I want you to go and spend time with any of our offices in the UK or abroad. I don't even mind if you go and walk the hills with that aggressive dog of yours. At least you won't be at this desk. And just to emphasize the point, Derek the following week sent me my new weekly planner. It went Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. There was no Friday. He sent me a diary page, but only 4-day-a-week diary page. There was no Friday. Interestingly, of course, and it sounds a little bit theatrical, it then became very difficult to put anything into a Friday that didn't exist. And that's, of course, going on in my head. Of course, Friday did exist, but in a way, Derek had resorted to a little bit of theatre and what have you there, just to illustrate the point. But I didn't achieve that in the first month, I had to say, but I got the hang of that inside 3 months. And it's something that, by and large, I've kept to, even to this day, achieving 100% of the goals in 80% of the time. In the worst possible case, then you've still got an extra day to mop things up if it's gone horribly wrong. If it's gone fantastically right, then off we go. We have a spare day for personal development, walking the dog on the hills, or whatever it might be.
Thanks, Phil. Turning to the book, I've just picked out 1 or 2 key questions and seminars in a sentence, which I'll just mention and then ask you for your 1 tip going forward. But you don't need to answer these questions. They'll probably come up in the talks afterwards. I love this one. Who do you give your best hour of the day to, and is it the right person? Number 2, if you met yourself as a 20-year-old, what advice would you give yourself? What could you do today that your future self would thank you for? I thought those 3 were great, and I'm going to reflect on those. In fact, we might brainstorm those on a future mastermind group. And then you've got these seminars in a sentence. I think that's what you called it. Sorry, I've written it down. If someone was trying to buy your business, or it might be your house, what would you hope they wouldn't find out? That amused me. And the positive side to change, you don't hear a caterpillar complaining about being a butterfly. I thought they were great, but they were my take on it. There's 365 of them in here, Phil. And how do people get hold of it? Or how do they buy 5 of them as I did? And I did promise you for coming on today that I would match the £5 profit that goes to the NHS.
Well, that's very kind of you. I just so everybody knows, I set out to sell 200 of these, and I'm now up to 510, I think it is. I decided not to put the book onto Amazon because of the setup costs. So I produced it locally with a very good printer who was happy to take part in this charity project. Basically, the book is 9.99, three numbers I think that are quite appropriate for the emergency services. So the book is 9.99, and literally half of that goes straight into the NHS and care worker charity. So every penny of it basically above production costs. So if anybody would like said book, best done through your good self, Derek, probably, and then just let me know. You can either hook me up with people direct, or you could be the focal point, however you want to do it, and off we go from there. For people that might want the Kindle version, that is on Amazon. So that version is on Amazon, but people prefer the hard copy version, as indeed you did, Derek, because the thing lays flat on the desk and it's a very accessible, spin the page each day type of format.
Okay, Phil, that's fantastic. I'd be delighted to do that for you. So email me, because on my email's easier, but you can also find Phil on LinkedIn and connect with Phil. Phil, that's been absolutely fantastic. I'm going to switch the recording off in a minute and then the questions will flow, I know. But before we finish the recording and put it on YouTube, one last tip for people going forward, thinking about 2021 in these volatile times. What would you say to them?
Well, the very first thing that I put in the book was half a page on Captain Tom Moore, brackets honorary colonel, of course, now, complete with fly past over his house and OBE or knighthood or whatever it was with the Queen the other day. And one of the things I loved about the interview with Tom Moore is that he had this lovely one-liner of, we all have to believe that tomorrow is going to be better than today. And that was the one-liner I finished that opening paragraph with, because I found that very inspirational. The other thing I would add is that in terms of going forward, I think there is a lot of value in only focusing on things that we can control. One of the sections in that book is titled Become a Control Freak. I don't mean become a control freak in the conventional sense of that phrase. I'm talking about only focusing on things that you can control rather than things that you can influence or maybe things that are of concern. It's very easy to get concerned about COVID-19, Brexit, and all the rest of it. But I think there is some peace of mind that comes from saying, well, actually, I'm just going to focus on the things I can control. I would suggest go for 3 for reasons we know about. What are the 3 things I can control, and focus on those, because it leads to a much happier state of mind, because you set off each day basically saying, well, I've done everything that I can do. I just need to deal with the day now as it comes at me.
That's absolutely fantastic, Phil. And if anybody wants a copy of Phil's book, please email me at action@derekarden.co.uk. If you're watching this on YouTube or listening to this on the Negotiators podcast. Phil, thanks so much for joining us. And if you'll stay on the line, that would be appreciated.
Yep. Okay,
thanks
sure.
very much indeed.